Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Mieko and I'm part of the events team here at University Bookstore in Seattle. Tonight, we are proud to present author Denny S. Bryce for a discussion about her latest book, In the Face of the Sun. In conversation with Denny will be bookstore owner and writer Natalie Jenner, who is the author of the forthcoming novel Bloomsbury Girls, coming out next month on May 17th. Denny S. Bryce is the award-winning author of the historical fiction novel Wild Women in the Blues. She is a former professional dancer and public relations professional. She is now an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Drexel University, a book critic for NPR, and a freelance writer whose works has been published in USA Today, Harper's Bazaar, and Frolic Media. Links for In the Face of the Sun and any other books mentioned during this talk will be listed in the chat. Please submit any questions you may have for Denny or Natalie in the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. There will be a brief Q&A session near the end of the discussion. This talk is being recorded and can be viewed on our YouTube channel shortly after the event. I will now turn the microphone over to Denny and Natalie.
Thank you. My goodness, how's everyone doing out there? I hope you're fabulous. And I want to just dive in because I think that now we want to hear a little bit more about Natalie. I know we're talking about I got to remember the books, In the Face of the Sun, but let's talk to Natalie for a few minutes because she and I share a past, and that past was during the pandemic. We both were debut authors, and that experience and a group of authors who were also debuting in 20 and 21, it kept shifting. We got together in a huge Facebook group, and there was a lot of sisterhoods formed in that group. So I really would like to share a little bit of that history before we start diving into Natalie asking me questions about In the Face of the Sun. So share some, because your first novel, your debut novel, The Fabulous, the Jane Austen Society book, wonderful, but I'll let you talk because, you know,
no, I mean, we've definitely all bonded. I always say that being in that debuts group, the 2020 debuts in a pandemic, we bonded like when you go to summer camp or prison. Like we really got to see sort of everyone's highs and lows. We were like picking each other up and cheering each other on, and it was really wonderful. And you and I as individual writers, like we also have a lot in common because we're a little older than other people.
A few minutes.
Just a few minutes, like a dominant twin. And
right.
And we also have had many careers. And my bookshop is now closed, but I've been a lawyer and I've been a human resources manager, a career coach, a bookstore owner, a writer, and you, Denny, have been a dancer, an actress. We've both run our own businesses. You ran your own, I think, marketing PR firm, events work. You're a prof now as well, like you teach in an MFA program. So it's very interesting to have that in common as well. And the last time that Denny and I spoke, there was a tornado warning, I believe. Wasn't it? You were literally like almost under your desk there. I remember.
Right. I live in Savannah, Georgia, recently relocated. Actually, it's been 2 years, but I feel like the first year was just me in the house because pandemic and I wasn't doing anything. But then when we last talked, we did a virtual event just a couple of weeks ago. There was a massive tornado warning in the area in which I live. And so the sirens were going off. The folks couldn't hear the sirens when we were talking. So there was just a lot of activity that had very little to do with books, but had to do with me feeling confident and comfortable enough to stay on and hoping that the electricity didn't go out as well.
Yeah.
But that was an experience.
So congratulations, because today is the release day of your second novel, In the Face of the Sun. And don't you show the book.
There it is.
You know what I love? I love the page inside that always says also by.
Oh, I know. This is a first.
This is the first. This is
the
a
first
big
time this
deal.
page, I don't know if you can actually see it,
Yeah,
but it's an amazing thing.
it is an amazing feeling.
Bryce. More than one book. I hadn't even thought of that yet because frankly, this day has been just going very, very quickly. And so I hadn't, even though I got my books, I've been so busy. I didn't even do what they call the unboxing. I didn't have time to do it. It's part of the marketing thing for those of you who wonder what I'm talking about it's sort of like a ceremony, it's a ritual. And now that we have the internet and we have our phones and we have all sorts of recording devices, we share with our social media followers and our readers and what have you, the unboxing when we receive our copies of our books.
Never too late to unbox.
I might go at it again.
Go put them back in, pretend it hasn't happened.
The box is still, it's a big box. It might still be in the car. I've been bringing up stacks of books. But yes, this is my second novel and it feels different. It feels different. I can't exactly pinpoint the difference. It's still as exciting.
Yeah.
But there's nothing like the debut. The debut is like the first time, everything's the first.
Yeah.
This is everything, every other thing is the first.
Yeah.
So that's very different. Again, going back to the pandemic experience, now I actually went to the bookstore today and signed like 50, 100 books so that they could put up a pretty display. And E. Shaver Booksellers in Savannah is my hometown bookstore. I also feel like, University Bookstore in Seattle is my second home bookstore, because I had the absolute fabulous experience of doing one of my Wild Women in the Blues events here last year, virtually met with Julia Quinn and Joanna Shue.
Sorry, I'm no Julia Quinn.
Well, I could tell my Julia Quinn story, but I know we want to get to some questions about the book and things like that, but I'll tell my Julia Quinn story very quickly, how I got to meet her. I had started out as in the Romance Writers of America. One of the things that I did to help prep me for the world of writing was I entered a lot of contests. I would also call myself a contest junkie at the time because I was working so much that I only had like 3 months a year where I could actually write, and I'd write my 50 pages and submit. So I was a finalist, and the judges on the Wild Women and the Blues entry, the one that I won, was Julia Quinn was a judge, and my current agent was the other final round judge. So Julia loved Wild Women in the Blues. And from that, we just started chatting and talking. And so she's a pal of mine and she's fabulous.
Amazing.
So that's my Julia Quinn story.
Amazing. Actually, well, I read In the Face of the Sun a couple of weeks ago and I just loved it. And I love the 1920s. I mean, I'm a big fan of movies like you. And I actually, even just the Baz Luhrmann, Great Gatsby, just anything to, that atmosphere of time.
Mm-hmm.
And both your books now have one of their two timelines take place sort of pre-crash, pre-stock market crash, kind of like 25 to 28, like the good years. What is it about for you as a historical fiction author, Denny? What is it about the 1920s in particular?
The 1920s has attracted me through my maternal grandmother. Mm-hmm. She came to this country in 1923 from Kingston, Jamaica. And when I was a little girl, she had all of these photos on the wall of her when she was in her 20s, in the 20s. And I was fascinated by the photography. I was like, well, what are you doing there? Why you look that way and you don't look that way? Just being an obnoxious child. And the cars and things like that. So there was the visual that I was attracted to. Then when I was dancing, as many dancers do, I was dancing in New York professional dancer lifestyle, which meant I waited on tables to make some money. And one of the spots that I waited on tables called the Cookery. The Cookery was located in the Village, owned by a guy named Barney J. Josephson, who also owned Cafe Society, which is known for many things, including being the place where Billie Holiday first sang Strange Fruit. Well, one of the historical figures in Wild Women in the Blues is a woman named Alberta Hunter. When I was a youngster in New York dancing and waiting on tables, Alberta Hunter was making a comeback as a blues singer in her mid to late 80s, okay? And so my job was to bring her tea before her performance. And she and I bonded, and she's a former Chicagoan. So, and I, at the time I'm in New York, I was a former Chicagoan, and those stories and just the way she was so cool in her 80s, just energy plus, beautiful. I made big bucks anytime she was the headliner on weekends at the Cookery. So those two things really sort of connected me early in life to the 1920s. And I don't know what brought me, it's just the showgirl, the time period, the films, the silent films, Oscar Micheaux. I'm a film fanatic.
Yeah.
I love the film industry.
Yeah.
You know, the history of film and film directors, and going all the way back to definitely the silent films. So I think that's what draws me, because I mentioned the book that I'm working on now, which is 19th century West Africa and Europe, and of course, England. But the book after that is set in the 1920s again, except New York during the Harlem Renaissance, also before the stock market crash.
Yeah. Well, on this note, we should actually, for everyone watching, have you give us the elevator pitch, the essence, the gist of In the Face of the Sun, the book that they can now go get.
Now I'm trying to remember the elevator pitch for this book. I'd say that I know that for me, there was a little bit of A Star is Born meets, what was that other thing that was in my head with this? Well, meets 1968.
Yeah.
It was very in my mind to contrast and pitch a story that told about a 1928 Black Hollywood, and how something that happened during that time period had such an impact on one woman that by 1968, she was very different, completely different woman. So what happened and why the 40-year difference in 40 years did it take for her to make that turn and face what had happened in 1928? And then to make it more I had to have a character who was all about 1968.
Yeah.
And to me, the thing about 1968, in addition to all of the momentous or the historical impact, everything, so many tragedies from Vietnam, Dr. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, just Robert F. Kennedy, excuse me, just so much, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, so much was happening in society. And I was like, how do you tell a very human, character-driven story with this backdrop?
Yeah.
So I don't think that was an elevator pitch. No, it wasn't. But I honestly can't remember how I pitched this, because I'd have to look up the notes, because it's 3 books ago.
This book traces the life, I guess I would say multi-generational, in the sense that in the 2 timelines, there are different family members, and you get to meet a lot of different characters in this book. Daisy being the one who is, the very young, aspiring journalist, just starting out in life, falling in love. It's the 20s. And then 40 years later, we see her a lot through the eyes of her niece,
Yeah.
Frankie, who is in a troubled marriage, an abusive marriage, and is pregnant and is going to go on a sort of, Thelma and Louise type
Right.
road trip, which is
Yeah.
very filmic, very cinematic. And as a reader, I mean, I really loved getting to see Daisy later in life because I loved her so much as a young woman, and I really loved getting to see her through someone else's eyes. So it's felt more objective. And I
Yeah.
was wondering, for you as a writer, in choosing point of view, do
Mhm.
you just naturally know when you start a chapter or a scene whose point of view it's going to be in?
Yeah, but I spend my process, I think, gives me that. And my process, I'm not a pantser. I'm definitely an outliner. I'm going to give you all of my plot point turning points, and then I'm going to dive into characters and really try to pull them apart. And I did that. I mean, one of the things I'm noticing from just feedback from people who have read the story is that they always say character driven story with In the Face of the Sun. And that was very challenging for me. I didn't, I'm a young enough writer, with this being my second book, to not always know that I'm writing a character-driven story.
Mm.
Versus Wild Women in the Blues definitely had characters were monumentally important, but there was more adventure, I want to say. I don't know if that's the right word, but there was definitely a little bit more in your face adventure or action. When in The Face of the Sun, there's action, there's movement, but it is driven by characterization more so. And the thing with looking at the POV, I know I couldn't be in Daisy's POV in the 1968 storyline because she doesn't represent that time period. And having Frankie, Frankie came off the page very fast for me. I especially once I wrote her opening, I knew her. I just
She
knew
felt
her.
very human. She felt very human to me, immediately relatable. I can see that in operation for you as a writer.
Yeah, that was something I was very excited about. Her growth, her arc, her decision making, her the mistakes that she made, the wins that she was able to accomplish. I enjoyed putting this young woman, I don't think this is giving away a big plot point, but she had suffered from polio. And so she had this long period of time as a child, as a young child. I think she was 8 or 9 years old, or 10 maybe, when she developed polio. And that experience, I think it closed her off from herself and from others. So it was a discovery for her, and a very interesting discovery arc. And Daisy was the perfect one to show her the way. Even though she's a little wild, I really enjoyed writing a vibrant, exciting, edgy 60-year-old woman. It was so much fun.
She jumps off the page. Daisy does. She's so sassy, and I just loved her. She was great. I also liked that. I did feel like a very filmic road trip, because I feel that one of the brilliance of the choices of the dual timeline within The Face of the Sun is that you get that passage of time between the stages of their days in the car. So it's like, is it 5 days or a week that they're going to be in this car, 3 people, and they're going to have individual, daily challenges or experiences. But then because you go back into the 20s and see Daisy as a young woman, then we come and rejoin her now 40 years later. And you feel that passage, that sort of like that very kind of like road trip feel. It's really, really wonderful.
I I really, the road trip was very important to me personally, as was the Mustang. Daisy happens to be the first name of my late mother. And I remember when some of the blurbs first appeared, I had family saying, "You're writing about your mother?" I was like, "Oh no." She would come back for me for that. No, I'm not writing about my Daisy, but the name worked. I just wanted that name so much. And I felt like my mother also owned a Mustang, and she owned a 68 Mustang, but it was probably in the 70s, or some, whatever. Whenever she had it, she did not allow us small children to get in the car. We had this other car. I don't even remember what that other car looked like, but we couldn't get into the Mustang. I was like, dang, this is not fair. I want to be in the Mustang. So this is why, and road trips are just such a family thing. Get in the car, let's go. It's summer. Let's get from one place to the other.
Yeah.
And but in the 1960s, as African Americans, getting from one place to another was never as easy. Never easy. So that was definitely an aspect of the road trip, the Route 66 that you always think of with glamour and this, that, and the other. I wanted to, punch some reality holes in that, in that mindset.
With the 1920 storyline and the elements of Los Angeles in the 20s and the couple that this hotel is being built, the architects, the movie stars, the people in the business. I've always been very intrigued by Hollywood. I have a major movie actress character in my first book, and some scenes that take place in Hollywood. And I had told my agent that I was thinking that for my third book, which I'm working on right now, that I would want to set it in the world of movies. And he said to me that it is notoriously difficult to write about film because you can't capture necessarily, similar to music. It's very hard to capture. It's easier to capture art, but it's hard to capture music and film that way. But you do such a great job because you're writing a lot of the business side of the industry side, right? As opposed to being on set. And I thought that was such a great choice.
Well, it's also, as with Wild Women in the Blues, but yes, in The Face of the Sun, I did explore more of the background of it. But I feel, not that I disagree with your agent, but I've heard this before about Hollywood being difficult to write about. Now, my fourth book that was recently announced, I'm doing a co-author thing with
Eliza Knight.
And that's called They Were Friends. And it's the story of Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe's friendship. So we're going into music and film. But one of the things I love about, if you love film, if you love music, if you love dance, being able to take what is concrete about those mediums and write about them in such a way that to me, one of the most important things to write about is silence and contrasting silence and movement with static, being static. And so what does sound do to you when you are in silence, when you have music come in and stuff like that? So I have this whole thing going in my head about sound and dance and film. So I think it's the challenging, fun, if you can deliver that to a reader so that they can actually feel movement and music, I think that's a fun effort to go for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like you. I think we're probably both a little contrarian because we are a little older. And when my agent told me that I like my third book is completely set in a movie studio, like all they're talking about are movies. And then it was like when it was like when I had 8 characters in my first book, The Jane Austen Society. And for the second book, everyone's like, 8's a lot. It's hard to put them into film and TV. And I gave them 9 with the next book. Like, we thought you said there were going to be 3 women in a bookshop, and there's like 9 characters. But I agree with you completely, Denny, because I think that what literature enables us to do is go into the consciousness of the response of the person enjoying the art. So what is it that is firing up your neurons when you're watching a beautiful ballet? What is it when you hear a great song sung by Billie Holiday? What is it that happens to you that is so enriching and so unique? And what, as writers, one of the gifts is being given a forum or a tableau on which to sort of try your best to capture that experience in a different way that will enable the reader to intellectually understand what is often just a knee-jerk response.
Exactly. Now, you were asking, like, in The Face of the Sun, I did handpick the historical figures I wanted in the story. And yes, there are quite a few different mentions, different moments, but the Hotel Somerville is a major element of the 1928 storyline. It's an actual hotel that is historically accurately portrayed to the extent that I could. It actually still exists in Los Angeles on the corner of Central Avenue and 41st Street. I think the last time I physically walked through it was in 2017. It was a senior living facility. So I took a lot of photos, and actually someone came and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to write a book one day about this place." And he said, "Well, come on inside." So she gave me this entire indoor tour. So the Hotel Somerville was the first hotel, luxury hotel, built in Los Angeles, that was built for African Americans, by African Americans, and financed by African Americans. The thing in Hollywood during that time period was that African Americans couldn't stay at the other hotels. So this was a monumental, big deal in the community and the city. There was a whole big parade. The mayor of Los Angeles came. A week after the Hotel Somerville opened, W.E.B. Du Bois brought the NAACP's first annual meeting on the West Coast to this hotel. And that was part of the entire, deal. So there were the reason for some of these historical figures was absolutely part of the history of the space. One of the characters in the book is Lincoln Perry. Lincoln Perry, also known as Stepin Fetchit, was a very controversial character. Actor, comedian, vaudevillian of his day. Now, he also was the first African-American to be a multimillionaire and have a studio contract. And he lived at the Hotel Somerville for a long period of time. So that's part of the story again. That has to do with research. You know how research can take you into these places where you discover things and you're like, how can I make this a part of the story?
Yeah.
I gotta get it in there. And that happened and fit the character who was the POV character and the conflict that she was dealing with her sister, with her friend Malcolm, who was also inspired by an African-American architect of the time, who was the first African-American to be a part of, his name was Paul Revere Williams. Yes. He was the first Black architect to be a part of the National Association of Architects, or I don't have the right name of the organization, but there was just so much history to play with. in the 1928 story, and then just the hard facts of 1968. You didn't even have to oversell 1968. You just had to make sure you knew when the things were happening and how these people survived it, how people dealt with that in addition to their lives, their day-to-day lives that, you know, didn't always have to do with racial conflict or prejudice or civil rights. It had to do with one-on-one circumstances and how that affected the men in the story.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of great male characters in the story. And I had this very weird soft spot for Malcolm, which I won't.
Yeah.
And
Malcolm and Isaiah caused me some.
I can imagine. I actually could feel it. I was reading it. It was it very much pulls at you in different directions, right? It's very complex. It's very reflective, I think, of the challenges of growing up, Black, you know, in those time periods, especially for men, right? I mean, obviously for men and women, but
Malcolm,
there was different, you know, different
Isaiah results. And Daisy's father represent three different approaches to surviving or being a part of a time period as an African-American man that didn't support, you know, which is reflected in today's society as well, didn't support Black men, you know, just didn't have an avenue for support. So those three characters were definitely, even though they were very different, I felt they were very different men. At the same time, they had a shared, they shared some things. Whether they'd want to admit it or not. In my mind, they shared things.
It was funny because you had shared an interesting anecdote about Lincoln Perry when we did our prior event involving a decision to acquire a lot of wardrobe and clothes.
Yes.
And okay, Denny, can you refresh my memory? And I apologize because I read your book 3 weeks ago. Is that mentioned though in the book, in The Face of the Sun?
I can't remember.
I can't remember either. Because
oh my God, I can't.
I just remember, like, just when you told me the anecdote, though, it's haunted me because it operated on a lot of levels for me. So please share with everyone what you told me.
It was in the book at one point in time. I can't remember right now because it's a couple of books ago. But Lincoln Perry was an extravagant kind of guy. I mean, he had a lot of money, he had a lot of power very quickly in his, well, not super quickly, but 1926, 1927, 28, he really started to, you know, explode. Well, someplace in there, Rudolf Valentino, who was a huge star, the name I'm sure people recognize, passed away young and was traumatized a nation because he was, you know, the beautiful man. Well, he also owned a whole bunch of gorgeous cashmere suits. And Lincoln Perry bought all of the suits because he couldn't see these beautiful suits going to waste just because a man died. So he bought his suits and wore them. And that is historically what I read and found in my research. And I don't know if I can't recall if it made it in the book. That's so sad.
But as historical fiction authors, that's what happens. Like you said, you get into these sort of Wikipedia rabbit holes and you start learning these incredible facts. I mean, you know, just when you were telling me about Alberta and you bringing her tea, you know, at the coffee shop, I was like, the cookery, that's a story in itself, right? I mean, there's so many great stories. I always think one of the roles of historical fiction is to shine a light on those hidden stories in the past, and those little cracks in the door of history. And we all know the big stuff that happened, but it's putting a human face on it. And it's also excavating. I mean, I love reading your book because I was learning things that I had no idea about. And that is so rewarding as a reader because you're being entertained, but you're taking away from it a sense of the possibilities of our world. And in the past, how much there is that we can learn from that we're not even aware exists.
I think there's a line, again, my memory slipping on books written in the past, but there's a line that one of the characters in 1928 has about, they're so excited about the changes that are taking place in the 1920s, and with the NAACP and W.E. Du Bois's work, the Crisis magazine, and so much. And one of the characters says, imagine how things are going to be for the Negro in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years. And to me, that's one of the saddest things said or pointed to in the story, because I think it's Daisy that says it, because that's part of her change, is the lack of change that between the 1920s, when there was so much happening on the civil rights arena, and then by 1968, where things had changed, but then things were just going back and forth. And then you look at what's happening, 2000, 2020, 2022. So it's just that time capsule where people are really functioning within the framework of where they are, who they are at that time period, and pulling out their personal stories against the backdrop of what was happening in society and culture and civil rights or whatever, is the other part, is the atmosphere your characters are existing in.
Yeah. As a writer, you've been enjoying writing, I think, for many years.
Yes.
And had been enjoying, you had mentioned the romance contest, the contest junkie in you. And you teach creative writing now as well.
I
And
actually teach marketing. I teach marketing so I'm going to be teaching the dual storyline class, master class, but at Drexel, I teach a marketing for authors.
Cool. Oh God, I could take that. Can I?
So much fun. It's so much fun.
That sounds amazing.
Well, it's the response of these MFA candidates to really seeing how their goals and aspirations as authors tie directly into how they communicate who they are, what they are offering to a broader audience through social media, through creation and developing a marketing plan that has a broader scope. And the real goal is get comfortable with this aspect of running your of running your author business, because that is a part of where that part of your brain comes into play. And so many authors, I think more and more authors are getting more accustomed to it. But at the same time, there's that pushback, like, how come I can't just write? And that's just not the world we live in anymore.
Yeah.
No, you have to be a part of the marketing mix.
I want the world of the 1960s with the whole back of the book with the photo of the author. Do you remember that? And like,
I do.
You'd write a book and that would be it, and then you'd go off and then you'd write another.
You'd go lounge in Italy for a long period of time.
But at the same time, one of the great things about social media that you and I have been able to benefit from, and I think be comfortable with, is that in sharing yourself in certain ways, you help the reader understand why the book is important to you on an emotional level, and what you put into it that you wouldn't normally get. And I find it very enriching to,
absolutely,
and so I'm grateful that I've had a forum to be able to share my personal stories through the journeys of both my books.
Well, I think that goes back to our pandemic experience. I mean, the what do they call it? Your marketing model for book tours changed dramatically during the pandemic. That's where the birth of the virtual, event really kicked off. And what's as exciting to me is the merging of book tour in person to virtual, with the virtual, and just the way independent bookstores nationwide and other retailers look at how they want to communicate with authors and how authors are communicating with them. I mean, I am reaching corners of the US and now England with some of the work I'm doing with the History Quill that I never have access to. 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been a thought. And now it's less like, yeah, we're doing it virtually. You know, what's the problem? Here we go. And
Great
whoever.
for me, I mean, being from Canada, like I would not normally be able to go to so many American bookshops, and I get to meet, as a former bookshop owner, I love meeting different bookstores across America. It's so much fun.
It's a fabulous thing. It's a
Yeah,
fabulous thing.
yeah.
Yeah. I was looking that we might have some questions.
Do we have some questions?
In the thingy, I don't know. But if you have more questions for me.
There was a question from Susie McMahon. She wanted to know, was In the Face of the Sun easier to write for you than Wild Woman in the Blues? Given that it's your second novel, given the success of the first novel.
Yeah. I will say that, oh gosh, I don't think any book is easier to write. Any book that you're working on causes the same amount of stress and the same amount of joy as the one before. The difference in storytelling and story structure is something that fascinates me and also causes me to think differently about the story I was telling. With Wild Women in the Blues, I worked on that book for 6 years. And there was a lot of stopping and starting. It wasn't like I was sitting around writing for 6 years. I was running a business. I was doing all sorts of things that had nothing to do with writing. I stopped doing all of that about a year ago. And I say that In the Face of the Sun, I probably worked on for 2.5 years, 2.5 to 3 years, much tighter, you know, sequence of events. Plus it was a different type of book. I really enjoyed, they're so different. The two books are different, similar, but different. And I really enjoyed working on In the Face of the Sun. And a lot of that had to do with Daisy. It really had to do with Daisy. I loved her in 28. I loved her in 1968. So I can't answer that question because the book I'm working on now is my favorite book. And the book I work on after that will be my favorite book. It's whatever I'm working on is my favorite book and my favorite characters. So it's crazy pants.
Well, you two were having a brief discussion about multiple perspectives before we started the event. And I don't know if you want to get into that right now, but you do have multiple points of view. And it gives you kind of more of a panoramic view of the world that you've created, whether it be in 1928 or 1968, that I really appreciate. Both of you have written books in that manner. Can you go into a bit more about that?
I think we were talking about the difference between the dual storyline and multiple POVs. Natalie is the multiple POV queen. I am the dual storyline.
And the more the merrier.
I'm playing with it. I'm playing with it this next book. But the dual storyline is, I have been asked why I would start with a book that had a dual storyline, because it is a bit more challenging. But I am a fan, a huge fan of dual storyline stories. Some of my favorite authors, Beatrice Williams, Fiona Davis, Chanel Cleaton, God, I think Karen White, just there's a whole bunch, oh gosh, Kate Quinn.
Well, Eliza Knight's new book, The Mayfair Book.
Eliza Knight, my co-author, yay, Eliza, who just made the Canadian bestseller list in the global, the world.
Global Mail. Yeah.
Global Mail. Yeah, she's number 7. for the name of her book is The Mayfair Bookshop. And you know, it's the dual storyline just offers, I like to say in short, and then I want Natalie to talk about multiple POVs, but the dual storyline gives you the opportunity to sustain mystery, up tension, in my opinion. And it also, what I do is I like to have both storylines have their turning points at the same time in the story, so that you're really building and connecting what may seem like two separate paths, but they're never separate. They're always connected. So that's what I'll say about dual storylines.
And dual storylines enable you to get into different characters' points of view, maybe, or the same character at a different stage in their life. For me, I tend to write, I'm a pantser, so I tend to start with a scene and just write forward. And so my books tend to be chronological. There sometimes there's some flashbacks, but those actually usually come through in editing. But I love going into lots of different people's heads, because being a big fan of Jane Austen, obviously, my first book has her name in the title, so
right.
she's a huge influence on me. But she was one of the pioneers of free and direct discourse, which was the setting of the text with a omniscient narrative voice, but then going in to different characters' consciousness and then back out again and into someone else's. And what I love about that is I love that the narrative voice becomes like a character in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And the narrative,
Very
the
much so.
space between the narrative voice and then going into the individual character's head is where you as the writer can create irony and different forms of humor, and also thematic richness. I really love that. Also, I remember when my audiobook sample came through to my editor at St. Martin's, and he emailed me. He doesn't usually get into the kind of like more, I don't want to say like airy part or emotional part of the craft. But he said,
right.
he goes, what voice do you hear when you're writing? Which you have to know my editor. That's such
What's going on
funny
in your
question
head?
coming from him, because like this, I was just like, I've never thought of it either, because I'm actually quite like him. So anyways, I was like, oh, and I thought about it and I went, well, I hear the narrator, of course. And he's like, so the narrator's not you? I'm like, no. And he's like, well, who's the narrator? I was like, the narrator's another character, and they don't sound like me. And
Right.
and I had to really think about that, and really as a writer I had a lot of fun kicking that around in my brain, which is like, where is that voice coming from? That's why I love
thinking about is theater and breaking the fourth wall. Same thing in film. And that, or the classic, Our Town. Are you familiar with the play?
Yeah, Thorne and Wilder. Oh yeah.
Oh, of course. And so you have your narrator, or the what's the actual name for that role, and I can't think of it right now, but it happens with every play. You are stage manager or whatever it is, and in that play, that voice was so important. And then you had all of these multiple POVs happening, telling their own little stories. But I love how that's where my film thing, one of my inspirations for a book that's a little bit further down is The Talented Mr. Ripley, but not the movie. The book, which was written in the 1940s by a woman, and it's amazing. It's an amazing book. So I hear you about just having that those other voices as you're writing is such a part of the process. You get caught up in that in a wonderful way, in a very
interesting
positive
that you
way.
use the word cinematic, because I hadn't really thought of it before. But there's a fellow author, Bianca Murray, and she and I were doing an event a couple years ago, and she's, I believe, a pantser as well. but she said, no, we're talking about characters. So we don't plan our characters ahead of time. Our characters just show up. Like they just show up and you're like, oh, there you are. I'm so glad to finally meet you. And they're like, and you know them right away, you know everything about them. And I said to her that when I write, I feel like I'm looking through a camera down and my eye is the camera and I'm following and I'm actually just I am actually typing what I see through a camera. So Denny, if it's really interesting, but if you look at the big chapter beginnings of the Jane Austen Society, which I wrote very sequentially and very, very quickly in a kind of Jane Austen feverish kind of like thing. But it's often a character and then there's another character looking down on them. So the first thing you see is somebody lying on a stone wall or on a patio lounger or sitting in an auction chair. And then the next question for me as a writer is, who is looking down on them? And sometimes it's another character that's about to meet them. And it's very filmic. And Bianca said that when her characters show up, she looks at the story through their eyes. So like that old bionic woman Barbie doll, like she's like literally looking through their head out through their eyes at everything, but I'm looking down on them through a camera. And I
I'm
think
looking at a proscenium like stage. I'm looking
that's your,
at
and that's
them.
your theater background.
And the action that's happening in front of me.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I love the
really
looking
cool.
down. I love the looking through the eyes.
Yeah.
And I'm watching a film as I write. I'm seeing a film because and I don't. You were talking about you write in a linear. I write all over the place. Me and my Scribner are very happy because I have.
I don't even know what that is.
Oh God, you don't know what Scribner is life. Life on this planet. But yeah, it's a writing thing. I won't even go into it because it's crazy. But it's heaven. But I don't write in order. I've never written in order. But I have this intense outline. I have scene. I know what the scene is. I do a rough draft. Boom, and then I can go with my mood. If I want to write, about in this book that I'm working on about Sally in 1855, or do I want to write about somebody else in 1901? It's just I know what is happening in the world at that point in time, so I can move around, and my emotional set has already been outlined. So I know what emotional place I'm stepping into with the characters as well. It's fun talking to other authors because it's always something different. And it's always sounds like something so interesting, the approach. I love the looking down. I love the through the eyes. But my, theater and dance major in college, and a old film buff, I always see the movie playing out in front of me. The whole set. I see the whole set.
That also was a follow-up question someone had about advice for someone who is writing their first memoir or novel. And I think you both did that really beautifully. Also, someone wanted to know to Denny, how is the book launch going?
The book launch is going really, really well. This is just day one. It's different because I'm trying to remember last year and maybe I don't need to, but I have a lot of things coming up. What's really super different is that I'm also on a big deadline. So it's looking at the things that are coming, the things that I'm doing, everything from, I'm traveling to Nashville this weekend for an event. And that's going to be my first in-person event. So I'm really excited. And Eliza Knight is coming with me. We're going to meet there in Nashville. And so it's going really well. It's just very different. It's just, with the deadline, it's like fun, pull out the, as soon as you get done with the fun, it's like back to this, and, getting the books done. But it's an experience that I'm just very excited about it. I write full time now. And that's pretty cool. I did not expect that to happen as quickly as it has. So that's an adjustment. Definitely have to pay attention to different things to make sure I stay on track.
All right. Well, we're coming close up against our time here. Natalie was a trooper because it's pretty late where she is right now.
Oh,
But I wanted to thank both of you for tonight's conversation. And I also wanted to thank tonight's audience for watching and anyone who will be watching the replay on YouTube later when it goes up. Links for In the Face of the Sun will be on our website, and we hope that you join us again soon. Good night.